Lecture 8, Earth Diver and Dismembered God Creation Myths.
In our last two lectures, we have been looking at different kinds of creation myths. Specifically, we have looked at an emergence myth, we have looked at a separation of world parents myth, we have looked at a creation myth of the cosmic egg, and an ex nihilo creation myth. This time we'll add two more to our list of different kinds of creation stories. We'll take a look at one that's called the Earth Diver, and for our example here, we'll use one from the Native American Huron. And then we will also take a look at the category called the creation of the cosmos out of the body of a dismembered god, and this one will illustrate with the Norse myth of Ymir. In the Earth Diver myth, someone dives deep into the primeval waters and brings up a piece of mud, which is then used, either stretched or grows somehow, to become the earth itself. These kinds of stories are most characteristic of Native American peoples, but they also occur in Asia, and that has led some people to suspect that there may be a common root for these, since Native American peoples did come across over the land bridge during the last ice age. Perhaps they brought with them memories of that kind of story and then adapted them for their own uses when they got here. In these kinds of stories, the first parts of creation are usually managed by a creator god, who then turns over the later stages of creation to a subordinate. In Native American stories, most often that subordinate turns out to be an animal, and there is sometimes some trial and error involved in what happens from here on. There's a really highly developed version of this kind of story from Hindu India. This one comes from the Vishnu Purana, which is a fairly late Hindu religious text, which dates from about the 2nd century CE. By the time we get to this version of it, Hinduism has already developed its cyclical view of creation and destruction. Every cycle lasts 100 years in Brahma's life, and at the end of the cycle, the universe, all gods, even Brahma himself are destroyed, and then come 100 years of chaos. At the end of that 100 years, Brahma is reborn and the cycle begins all over again. At the beginning of each new cycle, there is a great flood. Each cycle is further subdivided into stages, and we'll get a chance to look at some of those later in the course. And the years we're talking about are 100 years in the life of Brahma, not Earth years, because one day in the life of Brahma is the equivalent of 4,320 million years of Earth time. So these are vast, huge cycles. There are lots of different stories of how the cycle begins. In the Vishnu Purana, Brahma is called Narayana, which means Lord of the primeval waters. The primeval waters themselves are called Nara. At the beginning of each new cycle, according to this version, Narayana assumes the shape of a boar and then dives to the bottom of the primal deep and brings, with his tusks, brings the earth back up where it's been sleeping at the bottom of the sea, and it floats then for the duration of the cycle. This one turns out to be a very sophisticated version of an Earth Diver, because its real point is not to tell the story itself, but it's to meditate about the problems of appearance and reality. So that one goes off in a lot of different directions. The Huron version that we'll take a look at is a little more straightforward. The Hurons lived around what's now Ontario, and then they later on moved to Ohio and then to Oklahoma, where they still live. But the myth comes from the days when they still lived in the north. Their version of the story begins with a vast sea. It's a benign sea which is already inhabited by creatures who live in or on the water. And it is so benign that one day, when we're told a divine woman falls from the sky, falls out of heaven, falls to earth, two loons actually cushion her fall by catching her. Once they have her, they don't quite know what to do with her, so they use their distinctive cries to summon all the other creatures, and they all gather around and talk about what they can do with this woman who has just fallen out of the sky. When the tortoise comes by, the tortoise invites them to put her on his back so she has a place to rest anyway, but the animals all decide that she can't live that way. She needs an earth to live on. So what they do is they send one animal after another deep down into the primeval water to try to bring up a piece of mud that can be used to make the earth. There are many efforts and many animals fail to bring something up, but the one who finally succeeds in this version of the story is a toad who brings up a piece of mud, which the woman then spreads around the edges of the tortoise's shell, and from that the earth is formed. In this version of the story, is in fact, to this very day, the earth rests on a tortoise's back. It does in several other Native American myths, and interestingly in a couple of Buddhist myths as well. The woman turns out to be pregnant, and she gives birth to twins in time. The twins already begin to fight with each other while they're still in the womb, and one of them proves so recalcitrant that he refuses to be born in the normal way. He escapes through his mother's side and kills his mother in the process of his own birth. When she's buried, in a motif that we'll run across again, pumpkin vines and maize and beans grow out of her body. She becomes a culture hero, providing sustenance for people who will live on this new earth. The twins, meanwhile, go on finishing creation, and they maintain their characters as good and evil as in the process of the next creation stages. The evil twin creates serpents and panthers and wolves and bears, all of extraordinary size. One little detail is that even the mosquitoes that he created were the size of turkeys, large mosquitoes. And he finally creates an immense toad that swallows all the fresh water of the world. And so that means that the rest of the world then suffers from lack of water and begins to dry up, and famine and drought occur. The good twin, in the meantime, is making what the text calls useful animals, which we assume those are more adaptable to human uses. When he finally creates a partridge, the partridge, as soon as it's created, flies off toward the water, that is, toward the land of the evil brother. The good twin follows the partridge as it moves, and along the way he overcomes his brother's hostile animals. He doesn't kill them, he just somehow reduces them down to normal size so that human beings can manage to live with them. When he finds the toad, he cuts open the massive toad, releasing all of the fresh water, and the earth is saved. There are also some really neat little etiological details in this story about why things are the way they are. In one case, we're told that the good brother, when he was going to make streams, wanted streams next to each other to flow in opposite directions so that you could go with the current both ways, either coming and going, you'd be able to swim with the current. It is the evil brother who insists that all streams have to flow the same way, so that means that human beings have to work one way or the other. Since the two brothers can't coexist with each other, they decide that the earth isn't big enough for both of them. They decide to have a kind of fight to the finish to see who gets to inherit the earth. Because they are both divine, they realize that this fight could go on forever and ever if neither one of them knows quite how you can defeat and kill the other one. So they agree that before they start, each one will tell the other what his vulnerability is, and that way, at least when you're fighting, you know what you're going for, what you're trying to do. The good brother says that he can be killed only by being beaten to death by a bag of corn or beans, and the evil brother says that he can only be killed by being stabbed to death by an antler from a deer or some other animal. The fight is a fairly exciting one, but in the end, the good brother wins, kills the evil brother, and thus inherits the earth at the stage at which it's been created at this point. The evil brother, however, doesn't entirely disappear. Later on, after his death, he reappears to his good brother and says that he has gone to the west, and from now on he lives in a place where all people, once they die, will follow him, and all people will wind up in the west after death. As in so many other creation myths that we have looked at in this course so far, the beginning element, the primal element here is water. We've already talked about this, but Mircea Eliade says that water in creation myths always symbolizes pure potential, the source of all possible existence. All forms emerge out of water and return to it, as they will in flood stories or in cyclical stories of cataclysmic destruction, as we have in the case of India. And so immersion in water, diving into the water, means a kind of dissolution back to the formlessness of pre-existence. And thus, emerging from the water sort of suggests a kind of repetition of the act of creation itself, that toad coming back up out of the water with a piece of mud, in a way is recapitulating all of creation. And that's what happens in all earth diver myths, is that someone dives into this formlessness, brings up a bit of mud, and here recapitulates in this way all of creation. Water itself, of course, can never pass beyond potentiality, but what comes out of the water is always something. It's subject to time and to history and to growth and to change and death. And it's maybe why in this Huron story, the first death, the death of the mother in delivering her two children, comes so closely on the heels of the creation story itself. The twin brothers are kind of interesting in this story too. It's been suggested that this may be a Native American version of Cain and Abel. We remember in Cain and Abel, we actually have a conflict between two different ways of living, between agriculture on the one hand and nomadic pastoralism on the other. And here we seem to have a kind of conflict or competition between two different kinds of living, between hunting and agriculture. That's one way of understanding that fight between the two brothers. Barbara Sproul, in her Primal Myths, says that she thinks that perhaps these two brothers are simply a trickster character divided in half. We'll really get to the trickster character in Unit 4 and spend a lot more time with him. But for now, the trickster is a sort of divine or semi-divine creature who exists outside of the normal boundaries of good and evil, sometimes doing one, sometimes the other. The trickster is always partly a creator. Sometimes he enhances what's already been created, and sometimes he subverts it. The Maidu people from California have a story of their trickster, of Coyote, who comes into a world that's going pretty well, that everything that's been created is being really useful for human beings. But he winds up subverting a lot of it by creating, he wants to be a creator himself, and he creates a lot of deficient and flawed human beings. And in the process, he also brings death into the world. The trickster always does this, not because he's malicious, but because he's restless, he's mischievous, he's curious. He just does what he does, and sometimes good things happen, and sometimes bad things happen. That's just the way it goes. Here, Sproul says, what we have is a trickster character probably divided into a pair. They're twins who jointly work out the next stages of creation. So the good and the bad have been divided into two different characters. The world we live in is of course, a product of both of their efforts. In this story, it's easy to separate the good from the bad, but they are twins, and the relationship can't ever be entirely pried apart. The only thing that's really quite certain in this story is that the mother's value is entirely positive. All these new plants sprout from her body, and we'll run across that motif again later on in our course. The second type of creation myth we'd like to take a brief look at today is that of the dismembered god whose body makes the cosmos. This one is found all over the world, from the Aztecs to the Babylonians to Indonesia to North America to India to Scandinavia. We've already had a couple of examples of this story in this course, in the story of Marduk and Tiamat and in the story of Panku. Bruce Lincoln, in his book Myth, Cosmos, and Society, says that there's a really compelling version of this kind of myth in the Indian Aitareya Upanishad. In it, the lone self, that is the creature, the being, whoever it is who starts all of creation, creates the universe and then creates the first man, Purusha. He creates Purusha, this first man, as a kind of amorphous mass, which then he has to work on with heat to turn him into something. The quotation from the text goes exactly like this. The self heated that one. When it was heated, its mouth broke off. From the nostrils there was breath. From the breath, wind. Its eyes broke off. From the eyes, there was vision. From vision, the sun. Its ears broke off. From the ears, there was hearing. From hearing, the four quarters. Its skin broke off. From the skin, there was bodily hair. From the bodily hair, plants and trees. Its heart broke off. From the heart, there was mind. From mind, the moon. Its navel broke off. From the navel, there was the downward, that is the anal breath, and from the downward breath, death. Its penis broke off. From the penis, there was semen. From the semen, waters. This part describes the creation of the universe out of the body of Purusha. But the next part of the same text reverses the entire structure when all the deities come to live in Purusha. They come to inhabit Purusha. Here, the fire, having become speech, enters his mouth. The sun, having become vision, enters his eyes. The four quarters, having become hearing, enter his ears. Plants and trees, having become bodily hair, enter his skin. The moon, having become mind, enters into his heart. Death, having become the downward breath, enters the navel. The waters, having become semen, enter the penis. And so what Lincoln notes here, and this is a very, very explicit example of the way that cosmogony and anthropogeny are reciprocal. Primal man is disassembled to make the cosmos, which is then disassembled to make the human body. As we've noted before in a very easy example of this, inhaling makes the wind breath. Exhaling makes the breath wind. Cosmogony and anthropogeny are always in an eternal alteration in which matter passes back and forth from the cosmos to the individual. And all of this shows up in the Norse myth of Ymir. The source for this myth is a really interesting book that was written in Iceland in about 1200 CE by one Snorri Sturluson. It's called the Prose Edda. Snorri was a Christian, but he was also a scholar and an antiquarian, and in the book he gathered together all kinds of stories from pre-Christian days and therefore preserved them for his own people and then for us as well. And instead of combining all these stories into a kind of encyclopedia or anthology, he strung them all together in a narrative of his own, a narrative which is really an interesting one itself. It's a question and answer session featuring a king of Sweden. He has all kinds of stories in this book, and there are, in fact, 6 different creation stories in the book. They're told as if they're sequential, but they're really quite different from one another, and if you read them side by side, you'll notice that they contain all manner of contradictory elements. It's been suggested that this may have been part of Snorri's plan. As a Christian, he wanted to show that these stories were interesting but erroneous. They were human efforts to find God and truth, but without revelation, they're all bound to be slightly wrong. So they are, for Snorri, just stories. So when you read Snorri, you have to read them in this spirit, maybe a little bit the way we have to read Beowulf, which was a pre-Christian story, which was written down by a Christian, and so we have to be aware of the kind of angles of vision we're getting on things in a book like this. Snorri begins his story before the coming of Ymir, before the creation of Ymir. At the very beginning, he says, there were 2 regions. There was a northern region and there was a southern region. The southern region was called Muspel. It was ruled over by someone named Surt with his flaming sword. It's full of flames, it's full of heat, it's full of light, it's full of sparks. And then to the north, there was a place called Niflheim. And Niflheim was a place that was as cold as the other place is hot. It has a spring that grows out, that comes out of the middle of this. And that spring produces rivers, but the rivers immediately freeze as they start to run, causing layers and layers of ice. In between those 2 places, there is a kind of neutral zone, a sort of no man's land, which is called Gununga Gap. And in that place, heat and cold meet. And the meeting of heat and cold in this version of the story turns out to be that meeting of yin and yang, that meeting of opposites out of which creation always emerges. We've seen this in other stories. As always, the kind of yin and yang that we get here in this story is based on the experience of the people who made the story. This is, as somebody said, this is a northern version of yin and yang. This is yin and yang with a northern accent. H.R. Ellis Davidson, in a book called Gods and Myths of the Viking Age, reminds us that Tacitus, the 1st century Roman historian, actually went and lived with those Germanic peoples for a long while, and then did a book telling the Romans what these people were like. And she said that he had discovered that Germanic peoples got salt by pouring water from a salt spring on burning wood, so that the combination of heat and cold, of water and fire, would have provided them with a really neat homology for the conditions of creation. In the same way that, as we saw in an earlier lecture, the Egyptians would have thought of creation as the process by which those hillocks of mud emerge after the inundation of the Nile begins to recede. And it's also, salt is important because salt will play a big part in this creation story in just a moment. Davidson also says that in Iceland, that volcanoes, it was a volcanic country, but the volcanoes themselves were actually covered with ice, so that when they erupted, you not only got burning lava, but you got floods from all that melting ice. And again, that combination of heat and cold, of fire and ice, would have provided these people with a really neat homology for the creation itself. It also, as we'll see in a later lecture, provided them the materials for their idea of the final apocalypse. Ymir, like so many other early creator figures, is himself somehow androgynous. And creation begins here. Ymir, by the way, is the first character who is created. He's not really quite human. He's more like a frost giant or a frost ogre. And he's the one who's first created by the meeting of these elements, by the coming together of heat and cold in this no man's land in the middle. He's sort of androgynous himself because one night while he's sleeping, the sweat from his left armpit, we are told in the story, produces a male and a female. He also, his left leg manages to beget on his right leg a son, and that son will become the ancestor of all of the future giant frost giants or frost ogres in the world. The other creature who's produced by this meeting of heat and cold is a cow. The cow provides milk for Ymir to live on, and the cow lives herself by licking ice blocks which contain salt. And in one of those ice blocks, as she continues to eat away at it, what emerges from inside that ice block is another figure, another human kind of figure. This one, when he is finally released from the ice block, turns out to be someone named Buri, who becomes the father of Bor, who in his turn mates with a giantess and produces 3 sons, the oldest of which will be Odin, who becomes the chief of the Norse gods. Despite this kind of intermarriage suggested between frost giants and human-like figures, the frost giants and the sons of Bor don't get along very well, and eventually his 3 sons kill Ymir. When they kill Ymir, Ymir spills so much blood that the entire race of frost giants is wiped out, except for one pair, as in other flood stories, who manage to survive with a boat, and then from whom all future generations of frost giants will be descended. Ymir's blood is later gathered up and made into the ocean that surrounds the earth. Then comes the dismembered god part of the story, since at this point Ymir's body is used to create the cosmos. Ymir's skull is used to make the sky, and a dwarf is placed under each of the 4 corners to hold it up. Sparks that are gathered from Muspel, that hot, flaming region to the south, make up the sun and the moon and the stars, and time begins as it always does in these stories, with their placement in the sky. The cosmos is then divided into zones. The sea land is given to giants. There's a fortress, Midgard, which is put in the middle, which is built for human beings. In fact, we're told that Ymir's eyebrows are used to make the wall around Midgard, and Ymir's brains then are flung up into the sky to become clouds. When Snorri sums up this process of making the universe out of the dismembered body of Ymir, he does a little poem in which he says this: "From Ymir's flesh the earth was made, and from his blood the seas, crags from his bones, trees from his hair, and from his skull the sky. From his eyebrows the blessed gods made Midgard for the sons of men, and from his brains were created all storm-threatening clouds." This leaves us only with the creation of humans. That's the last stage in this story. And humans are created when the sons of Bor come across 2 trees by the seaside, and they take the 2 trees and they shape them into human beings. The gods then find a way to give them all of the blessings they can manage. They give them movement, they give them sensibility, they give them intelligence, they give them the power of speech, the power of hearing, the power of sight. And these 2 human beings, Ask and Embla, become the Adam and Eve of the Norse version of the story. From them, all future human beings will be descended. The gods themselves meanwhile build Asgard as a fortress for themselves in the middle of the cosmos, and that's the way the universe comes to be the way it is. We can see how Lincoln's thesis about reciprocity works in this myth. The material which is used to create the cosmos is taken from Ymir, and then materials from the cosmos are used to create humans. Here, in a very, very precise way, the trees that were originally made from Ymir's hair become the matter which is used to make the first man and woman. Ymir is, in fact, a kind of poster boy for Lincoln's book. He's the very first chapter. He talks about the Ymir story and uses him as his first example of how this kind of myth works. That eyes become the sun and moon, that flesh becomes the earth, aren't for Lincoln mere metaphors. We've already used this phrase, but what he says they are alternate forms of each other, what he calls alloforms. Flesh and earth are alternative moments in a continuous process. One is always being transmuted into the other. In this kind of myth, there are some variations, but there are some alloforms that seem constant across all the different versions that we have in the world. The skull is the highest part of the body, and it also has this kind of dome shape, so it always becomes the sky. Alloforms of flesh and earth on the one hand, and bones and stones on the other, are also almost always constants. There are then alloforms between hair and plants, between blood and water, between eyes and the sun and or moon, between brains and clouds, between breath and wind, and all of these occur so frequently that they become almost standard. Lincoln finds 9 such alloforms which remain pretty much constant across the many, many different versions we have of this myth. And these alloforms, of course, function in a variety of ways. We've already mentioned this one, but it's worth mentioning again because I think it's very profound. Sacrifices are always ritual dismemberments of animals or humans which create the world by dispersing material from an individual body and sending it back out to the cosmos. The homology is precise enough if you're sacrificing an animal, but it's usually assumed that original sacrifices would have been the sacrifice of human beings, and that would have absolutely recapitulated the sacrifice of Ymir to make the cosmos in the first place. Eating does just the opposite, because eating takes foodstuffs that were created from the body of a dismembered god and takes it inside to make the individual body. Here, we move from the cosmos to the body itself. And as we've mentioned before, in this kind of theory, death itself becomes the cosmogonic act, which takes our bodily material and transforms it back into the cosmos. Breath becomes wind, flesh becomes soil, we become part of the cosmos again. And that means that every death is in its own way a kind of sacrifice, giving ourselves back to the cosmos so that it can go on. And every death recapitulates, therefore, the sacrifice of Ymir or of Panku or of Tiamat. As Lincoln says in summing up this little part of his argument, above all, the first death, which was also the first sacrifice and most important, affected the creation of the universe. For while death is the fate of all human beings, death is also a cosmogonic act. Whenever people die, their bodies replenish, sustain, or even recreate the universe at large. As we've mentioned before, in religions that posit a life after death, there's one more reversal that happens at the end of time. In an Iranian myth, at the end of time, Ormuzd, the great god, will summon back for each person who has ever lived bone from the earth, blood from the water, hair from the plants, breath from the wind, and so the entire cosmos will be taken apart at the end to recreate every human being who's ever lived. And the first one to be so recreated is a character named Geomard, who in their version of the story was that first victim, the Ymir of their story, who was taken apart in order to create the cosmos in the first place. The myth of the dismembered god suggests that when the world was created, it was created out of a body. Humans are created from the cosmos, and the creation of one also always implies the de-creation of the other. Matter is eternal, but it's always alternating between human and cosmic form. What we call birth and death are simply moments in the transition from one to the other. Next time, having taken a kind of brief whirlwind tour of different kinds of creation myths across the world, next time we will take a look at flood myths, which are always connected to creation myths by the motif of water. Water is the primeval deep out of which all forms emerge in so many different creation stories, and to which they can always return. If the waters are seen as the womb of life, they can also be the grave or the tomb to which it all returns. And then in the lecture after our next two, we will end with some apocalyptic myths which tell the entire creation story in reverse. That will be our next three lectures.